Yep. Hey, everybody, welcome in. We got folks streaming in from all across the world. We just went live. We're going to start the presentation in a few minutes because we're early, but we just wanted to say hi, hello to everybody. Welcome to the webinar. If you're on the East Coast, you're probably buried under snow, and if you're on the West Coast, then you're either being rained on in Washington and Oregon or having this ridiculous perpetual springtime in winter in California. So glad to see everybody. We got 35 people in right now, but it'll probably be, 150, 200 later. Cool. Well, the way this works for people who are new is you can type in your questions in the chat box and the question box. However, if you have questions for Judith, definitely wait till when we have the Q&A, because if you type your questions early, you might not get to them for the very end. So yeah, tell us where you all are coming from. I'm in Berkeley, California at the moment. Neil's coming in from Utah, and Judith's coming in from Vermont. Snowy, awesome Vermont. Cool. Definitely a lot of familiar faces. Elizabeth coming in from San Jose. Cheers to Russ for helping organize this. He connected us with Judith in the first place. Great. A lot of familiar names. We got Pamela, Peter Donovan, awesome. Jim, Jeremiah Martin, good to see you, Jeremiah. Dylan, Doris, Denise, Margaret from Calgary. All right, cool. So how about we put all this aside and get started? So Neil's going to introduce Sustainable Design Masterclass. I'm going to introduce Judith, but for that, make sure to get the most out of this. Turn off those side programs, Facebook, YouTube, any of those useless, distracting things, because to get the most out of Judith's presentation, which she's spent a decade building up to, turn off those programs. So I asked you to do that. And Neil, how about you introduce Sustainable Design Masterclass?
There we go. Recording is on, correct?
Yes, we let me double check. We are recording right now.
All right, welcome everybody to the Sustainable Design Masterclass. I'm really happy, Raleigh, that your name is under your face.
That finally.
Because normally it says Wayne Dorvan, but Raleigh and I started Sustainable Design Masterclass just over 2 years ago. We've been running these webinar series with experts and practitioners in all sorts of things related to land use, water use, sustainability, agriculture, ecology, and entrepreneurship. That's our niche. And we're really happy to have Judy Schwartz on. I think Judy and I met each other last summer at a conference in California, and that's where we first connected. We're really happy to have you on to talk about water. Judy is also the author of Cows Save the Planet, so I don't know if we're going to bleed into that, but it's also a good read. But welcome to Sustainable Design Masterclass. We're happy to have you all here. And Raleigh, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Neil. Appreciate it. So yeah, again, like Neil said, we're super excited to have Judith on. This is the second part in our series on water restoration. Now, I've been reading this book, Water in Plain Sight, which is the follow-up book to Cows Save the Planet. And Judith spent the better part of a decade researching this water restoration by going to nearly every continent and highlighting farmers, entrepreneurs, agencies who are actively moving areas that are desertified, that are just turned into dust, that look like they're lost causes. And by restoring water, they're actually moving the ecology back to something that people might not have seen in a lifetime. And this book is just filled with absolutely incredible case studies of how people can move succession forward and create, repair ecologies by bringing the water back to the land. And a little background on Judith: she's an author that's absolutely world-renowned. She's featured a lot on The Guardian. She's been on the Rewild Yourself podcast. Her book, Cows Save the Planet, is an incredible book. It's won an award, and this is her follow-up book, which she's kind of condensed into this presentation called Water in Plain Sight. So Judith, I hope I introduced you well enough, and without further ado, how about we get started?
Sounds like a plan. Well, hello, everybody.
So
Yes.
one last thing, I just want to make sure, can everyone see and hear Judith all right? Just give me some ones if you can see her and hear her. Okay, yes. And if you can see the presentation. 1, 1, yes, yes, yes. Okay, Judith, looks like we are good to go.
All right. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you, Raleigh and Neil. Such an honor to have the chance to speak among such great and inspiring company. I've seen the list of people that you've had on this masterclass, so really it is an honor. I don't know whether many of you were able to catch the last one, Walter Jena speaking about cooling the climate with water restoration. Walter's work has certainly been eye-opening for me, and his thinking is about 10 times the pace of most of us. He's quite extraordinary. And I just wanted to mention that because I will be dealing with some of the concepts that he had brought up, but I will do so from a different perspective, mostly through story. So let me begin and tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a longtime freelance writer, and through the years have written about all kinds of things. The great thing about being a journalist is that your job is to learn and ask questions. I make this point because I see curiosity as an underappreciated vice, yet it is crucial to where we are right now. And also to note that the quality of the questions that we ask will help determine where we as human beings on this planet will go from here. I really mean that seriously. So questions that I'd like to put out there that we might that we think about are questions like, how does water work? And how does the earth regulate temperature? Questions that we will be engaging in later on as we proceed. Most of what I've done in my career, we can skip. I mean, there's really no need to discuss, for example, the Cosmos sex quiz I wrote. However, I can tell you that I have a brief piece coming out in O magazine for Earth Day for the April issue. Next slide. Slide. Oh, next slide. Yep, Oprah. So yes, amazingly enough, the word soil will appear in Oprah's magazine that millions read. So this has got to be a cultural watershed moment of some type. So anyway, during the years of being underemployed, I started asking some questions like, what is wealth? Is the GDP the best measure of prosperity? Why does our economic system regard nature as an externality so that any impact to nature is off the books? These questions led me to soil, especially and specifically to the understanding that much of our excess atmospheric CO2 derives from the soil, from the way that we have practiced agriculture, and that through restorative agricultural approaches, we can return carbon to the soil where it has so many important functions, including, this we'll get more into, acting as a sponge to retain and hold and store water. Like many people here, I then developed a huge crush on soil. I know that sounds kind of like an Oprah magazine headline, like get a crush on soil. And so I wrote Cows Save the Planet, a book about soil as a hub for our many environmental, economic, and social crises, and for solutions. During which time, when I was writing this and researching, I encountered the book, The New Water Paradigm, the booklet Water for the Recovery of the Climate, which completely blew my mind. This is a document written by a group of scientists in Eastern Europe, led by hydrologist Michael Kropchik and botanist Jan Pokorny. There will be a webinar on this more specifically with them, so I will simply encourage you to read this brief book, as you can see here. As a communicator, I give a lot of thought to how we talk about things. For I believe that the way we talk about our challenges often interferes with our ability to do anything about them. For one thing, the way that we talk about things tends to limit the way that we think about them, so that we often default to a kind of mental shorthand that elides the opportunity and the need to ask questions. Also, the way that we talk about things often reflects beliefs that we have about a topic, and these beliefs are then perpetuated. In my book, Water in Plain Sight, Hope for a Thirsty World, I chose to look at water as a verb instead of as a noun. I zeroed in on water processes, stories of people who have learned to ally with the water cycle in order to reach their goals and in order to get the most out of their landscapes. For I contend that understanding how water works, how it moves across the landscape and through the atmosphere, can help us not only better manage our operations and do the work that we want to do, but also to address some pretty large global problems. So, how is water generally talked about? Mostly as a noun. Okay, let's slide. Thank you. Mostly as a noun, as something bounded by place, something you have or I have, or maybe we fight over it. Water is seen as a scarce resource, which under some circumstances may seem to be the case. But we know that water is continually renewed. And so there is water in plain sight, if we know where to look. Water is always in motion. It expands or retrenches. It retains or releases energy. It changes state, moving from gas to liquid to solid and back again in an ongoing dialogue with land, plants, and the sun. And here we have opportunity. Water is also often talked about without the context of land, as if they could be addressed separately. I'll give you an example, which is the kind of thing that made me nuts, and frankly is one of the reasons why I chose to write a book about water. A few years back, during the California drought, I don't know what situation is in California right now. I don't know if we call it the last California drought or the big California drought or California's version of the big dry. Anyway, around 2014, 2015, all the news reporting about the drought, and it was in the news a lot, focused on what was or wasn't coming down from the sky. Land degradation wasn't mentioned at all. Nothing about the sealing over of soil in urban and suburban areas. Nothing about the depletion of carbon in the soil. There was an article that made the rounds back then, which had the provocative headline, "To end the drought, California needs 11 trillion Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of rain." Thank you. I had just written this book on soil, and so my mind was focused on what happens when rain hits the ground, whether it evaporates or streams away, or, by contrast, soaks into the earth to nourish plant and soil microbial life. And so I found this swimming pool thing kind of amusing. You see, if all that rain falls on degraded, depleted, carbon-starved soil, on what we might want to call dirt, then California would be back in drought mode soon enough, and everybody would have wasted a whole bunch of perfectly good swimming pool water. But if you have good land, the kind of land like, of course, all of you permaculturists and land restorers work on, with nice crumbly soil rich in organic matter that soil carbon sponge, as Walter Jenne would say, well, then maybe we'd only need, say, a few billion kiddie pools worth of water. So let's break this down and look at various water processes and how these relate to our task of restoring global and local water cycles, which, as Walter Jenne and the New Water Paradigm folks have helped us to understand, have implications for restoring ecosystems and cooling the climate. We'll start with the basic concept that our California headline writers, clever as they may be, were missing, and that is infiltration. Alan Savory, whose work many of you know, and who developed the holistic management decision-making framework, draws attention to this, to infiltration, through the way that he talks about land. Rather than looking at the overall rainfall of a place, he says that what is important, much more important, is how much effective rainfall you have, how much of that precipitation soaks into the ground. So here, this picture, and I should say that many of the photographs my husband, Tony Epryle, took. Here, this is the Dimbengombe Ranch in Zimbabwe, near Victoria Falls, and that's the demonstration site for holistic management. So one thing to file away for would-be question askers is, I'm not sure how much this audience knows about holistic management, so feel free to ask questions about it during question time. I'll try to not overdo the explanation, but I'll try to get at some of the important points. So anyway, the use of holistic planned grazing has enhanced the water cycle in this area to the point, and water infiltration specifically, like in the banks of the river and on fields and grassy areas adjacent to this. It's a many thousand hectare ranch that we're talking about. But the water has been restored to the point where this river now flows a full 1 kilometer further up into the catchment than it has in living memory. And there is water in the river permanently throughout the year. So that is a huge, huge development. So another one aspect of this is, okay, so that we have the water when you want the water, but during the rainy season, it floods a lot less. So when we were visiting Zimbabwe, we looked at a spot with Alan Savory, and he was able to show by the debris that was stuck up in the branches of the trees where the flood level went. And in the parkland where they did not use holistic planned grazing, it went up about 3 meters, whereas in the Dimbengombe Ranch, where they've been working with holistic planned grazing, it went up about 3 feet. I mean, you could actually see that on what was caught in the trees where the twigs were. And so, as Alan pointed out to us, that the flooding waters would have been higher than the vehicle that we were using, one of those big Jeeps. So that was really, really interesting. So I went to Zimbabwe a few years back. This was in 2014, and saw where the land was restored, where rather than 90% bare ground, there was 90% ground cover. And Alan pointed out that whereas it's almost hard to find spots where they can to use as demonstration sites, as like to do little soil demos, because the land is so covered. They actually have to keep some areas where the grass isn't growing. there's a lot of confusion about holistic management, and I think it's useful to understand the underlying concepts from the perspective of the water cycle. So in an area of seasonal rainfall, this is what Alan Savory calls brittle landscapes. So he distinguishes between landscapes that are brittle when there's a distinct rainy season and a dry season, and landscapes that are non-brittle, where there's pretty fairly consistent precipitation throughout the year. It's distributed fairly evenly throughout the year. So I live in Vermont, and yeah, I can say that, yeah, it kind of rains or snows or sleets or something's pretty much, fairly evenly throughout the year. I mean, we've been having a lot of big rainstorms, so we're getting a lot of precipitation in that nice fluffy white form. Back to Alan and in brittle landscapes. So in these brittle landscapes, nature was presented with a very basic challenge. How do you maintain moisture in the soil from the end of one rainy season to the beginning of the next? And this is an essential function, because if you don't maintain moisture in the soil, then you're going to start losing soil life, you're going to start losing carbon, you're going to, the moisture will have evaporated, and you're basically starting on that path towards desertification. But nature doesn't want that to happen. So how do you maintain moisture in the soil from the end of one rainy season to the beginning of the next? Next slide. And the solution, thank you, the solution that nature came up with was through the digestive processes and behavior of grazing animals. The animals keep moisture in the system through their waste, through stimulating plant growth to feed microbial life and keeping that moisture cycling through the plants, and reincorporating decaying plant matter into the soil. So that soil is building carbon, which in turn holds on to that moisture longer. So we know, we know then that carbon in soil holds many times its weight in water. Managed animal impact helps build and maintain that soil carbon sponge. So the animals become a really important ally in both building soil and sustaining the water cycle, both of which, of course, are connected. And this is a picture of the cattle, the herd of cattle, moving out into the field, the area where they will be grazing for the day. This is at dawn, and the sun is just beginning to give you a taste of the heat that will be bearing down on that landscape throughout the day. It gets really, really hot out there in Zimbabwe. I can tell you. And that visit to Zimbabwe, one thing I will always remember is that it really gave me a new appreciation for a cool glass of white wine at the end of the day, because the sun goes down. It goes down quickly in Africa. The sun goes down quickly, and suddenly it's cool and it's so refreshing and beautiful. And of course, we also had the great pleasure of being with Alan Savory and hearing him tell us stories about the rhino that entered camp, and when he was taking a bath and things like that. So anyway, many, many pleasant memories in Zimbabwe. Neil, there's a statement that you made on a podcast. I think it was Earth Repair Radio, which is a podcast that I love and I've been telling people about. This statement that you made an impression on me, and it speaks to the importance of infiltration. You defined a desert this way: as a place where where it floods whenever it rains, because there is no capacity for the water to infiltrate. I mean, floods don't just magically happen. You know, the rain comes down, and if there is no capacity for that water to be held in the land, well, then you get a flood. But we know that this state of the land isn't inevitable or necessarily permanent. Once the land has the capacity to do so, to hold on to that water, it ceases to be a desert. And so here in Zimbabwe, we have a stretch of land that is functionally a desert. That's where the floodwaters went really, really high, right next to land that is not a desert, where the water infiltrated and has been building, been held in the soil, an area where they're now not only able to hold grass on the water, on the banks of the river, but they're also growing sedges and weeds, and where there are now wetlands where you're getting fish eagles and lots of different species that thrive in wetlands. So isn't that really interesting that right next to each other, you have a functional desert and an area that part of which is a wetland? I mean, that's extraordinary. That this happens more often than one would think might challenge our assumptions about deserts and lead us to consider the question, what is a desert, as well as why is a desert, how is a desert, and another question, which might be, what if we worked with the land in a way that we could hold water? And, you know, how might we be able to do that? And what might the implications be, not only locally, but globally, as we begin to deploy those practices, begin to share our the techniques and the wisdom that we learn from doing so. Back in Zimbabwe, we did a little detour into other desert, the notion of deserts, but back in Zimbabwe, the improved infiltration that resulted from this holistic plan grazing from our faithful cattle that we see here proved to be really significant in people's lives. I mean, you hear the word infiltration, it sounds a little wonky, but it's really, really meaningful. Next slide. I had the chance when we were visiting to meet people in villages, we visited several villages that are working with the Africa Center for Holistic Management. Animal impact on the people's crop fields meant that there was more soil organic matter, and that in turn meant better water infiltration. For the people of Sianyanga, Zimbabwe, a place way off a dirt road near the Hwange National Park, I mean, this place was so remote, it was quite unbelievable. It was people don't have internet, people, we brought a few things in plastic bags, and the plastic bags were an item that people were looking at and asking if they could have, which of course we shared with them gladly, but that really gives you a sense of the kind of they really don't have much interaction with the global economy, well, for good and for ill, that would be. But for these people, this enhanced water infiltration meant that they were able to grow food for 7 months out of the year, rather than only 2 months out of the year, which would be around the rainy season. And this difference that was really only came about through the enhanced capacity of the land to hold water, this meant the difference between food self-sufficiency and dependence on international food aid. I can't even tell you how proud and pleased these people were about what they have accomplished. It is no joy to be dependent on charity for survival. And they were proud also that now other villages came to them for help. I mean, the kinds of challenges that these people had because of the degradation of their landscape were quite extraordinary. So they would have to bring their cattle out to get water. And sometimes they would go maybe 25, 30 kilometers, and they might go with 10 animals and come back with 5. And they would have to go travel long distances to be able to get thatch to repair their dwellings. And now they can grow their own grasses for thatch. So anyway, it was really exciting to see how lives have improved through these practices. Now we'll have a look at the impact, in a different kind of impact, in another place that I visited. Next slide, please. This is in Chihuahua, Mexico, and these are some beautiful bull specimens. I just think they're gorgeous. I just like them. I went to the Chihuahuan desert grasslands, where ranchers are working with bird conservation organizations who are creating a biological corridor for endangered migratory grassland birds. The ranchers who practice holistic plant grazing are keeping more water on the land. Their neighbors, however, say, "Of course your cattle are doing better. You get more rain than we do." And so, I mean, what do you think? They're right next to each other. But anyway, that's what their neighbors think. And so these particular ranchers are growing a diversity of grasses to feed, shelter, and protect birds that would have trouble surviving on desertified land, which, alas, much of the region has become. This is a really interesting project because usually one wouldn't think of ranchers and conservationists, bird conservation professionals, as being necessarily allies. Often we hear about ranchers being in conflict with land conservationists. But what happened was the bird conservation people, the Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory, I think they actually have a new name, but that's what they were at the time I was working with them, and the American Bird Conservancy and Pro Natura in Mexico. The North American groups were realizing that there were great losses in the numbers of many types of grassland birds, including some pretty iconic songbirds. And many of these birds, you know, they had been focusing on their summer habitat, which is in the northern Great Plains in the US. But actually what was happening was that the land was changing so rapidly and dramatically in their winter habitat, where they spent 7 months out of the year in the Chihuahuan desert grasslands in this very, very specific ecosystem. So what they found was that ranchers who were using holistic plant grazing were generating great diversity and, you know, great stores of grasses. And these were kind of oases for these birds. So I remember, you know, not being a bird professional, I was, amused when a fellow from the American Bird Conservancy said, yes, it was very birdy on those ranches. So yes, this is where the birds were able to find their habitat. But, you know, it's a real concern being down there, you know, really opened my eyes to some challenges because they're losing a lot of these grasslands. They're desertifying. One reason is because of poor grazing practices that many people in the area tended to use what's called continuous grazing, which basically means just leaving the animals out on the land, which means that the animals are going to stay in one place and overgraze and leaving other parts of the landscape with very little animal impact, which means that the grasses grow, and when the grasses die, rather than being, the grasses just stay there and oxidize. They're not being pressed into the ground the way they would be when animals are trampling the ground regularly, or actually according to the schedule that the rancher has devised. But you want the trampling is important because it presses in seeds, so that a diversity of grasses has a chance to grow. But also it presses in the dying and decaying grasses, so that the grasses come into contact with the soil microbiology, and that plant matter gets reincorporated into the soil, so that you get organic matter, and you get carbon-rich soil, and the carbon-rich soil means more perennial grasses, and you get a virtuous cycle happening. Another problem down there in the Chihuahua grasslands, which was also kind of, like a big surprise and very concerning, is that because many of these ranches were doing so poorly, because they were losing grass, they were spending their money on feed, and they were going out of business, they were selling the land very cheaply. And Mennonite farmers were coming down from Canada, and they could buy land very cheaply. They were plowing up this land and practicing agriculture in a way that is really chemically intensive, tillage intensive. And we saw those farms, and this was before the planting season, and it was just dirt and mud, and basically a biological desert. So a different kind of desert. It can be wet and be a desert too. So anyway, the next slide. Yeah, so this is how it gets started. This is in Chihuahua. So animals had been here, and perhaps this is very early in the process, pressed in seeds, and those are perennial little tiny bits of grasses that are beginning to come out. Also, the animals that their hooves can make little craters where the water can pool. I know this is not a beautiful landscape, but this just shows a real microcosm of how the process towards moving towards perennial cover begins. And so here in Chihuahua, better water infiltration helped to support biodiversity. At the same time, we know that enhanced biodiversity means enhanced land function and enhanced water cycles. Creatures from worms to prairie dogs to beaver enhance water infiltration by slowing down moving water and providing that water with a chance to linger. So it works both ways. A healthy water cycle supports biodiversity, and biodiversity helps to support the water cycle. So I don't know how many of you producers or land managers out there in the audience integrate livestock into your farms and projects, but there are many benefits that help with this enhanced infiltration. For example, next slide. Thanks. Kelly Mulville in Northern California has an innovative project with holistically managed sheep in vineyards. Thanks to more organic matter, increasing at 1% a year, and therefore better water infiltration, they were able to reduce irrigation by 90% and also see a rise in yield. Originally, Kelly was focused on the land health and not necessarily on the wine, not being a vintner, so he wasn't sure what effect this practice would have on the taste of the wine. But the winemaker did a blind test, and guess what? The grapes grown with the sheep produced a tastier wine. Now we're moving away from infiltration, and we are going to talk about transpiration, another verb, another water process. So next slide. While researching Water in Plain Sight, I interviewed Antonio Nobre, author of a report called The Future Climate of Amazonia. Thank you. The Amazon rainforest has about 4 billion trees. Together, Nobre says, these trees act like geysers and spout a river of vapor into the air, an aerial river through which flows 5 times as much water as the Amazon River itself. This flying river that Nobre describes is the result of transpiration, the upward movement of water through plants. You can think of it as the plant sweating, the stomata on the leaves, or if grass, the blades, open to retain or release moisture to cool the plant itself and the nearby vicinity. What's important is that this is a cooling mechanism, transforming solar heat into latent heat and suspended in the vapor. This is as opposed to sensible heat, or heat that you can feel, like on a hot sidewalk or on dried out, desertified, bare ground. According to Czech botanist Jan Pokorny, who you will be hearing from in a few weeks, he is one of the authors of the New Water Paradigm, the transpiration activity of one tree on one sunny day represents 3 times the cooling capacity of an air conditioner system in a 5-star hotel. Now, this cooling factor of transpiration is important, vitally so, and it needs to be brought into our discussions of climate because, well, I mean, it's a huge, vast opportunity. Usually when we talk about the connection between climate and water, the discussion only goes in one direction. In other words, people talk about how climate change will put stresses on water sources, added stresses through water sources throughout the world. And of course, this is a big concern. But what we've been leaving out is water's effect on climate, for that's where we have huge opportunity. And this is very much what Walter Yenna's webinar was on. And I encourage anyone who hasn't seen that to do so, because it's really, really compelling. I have found this work just so compelling and hopeful. So, basically, the cooling is one really important aspect, but one other of transpiration, but also transpiration drives the movement of water. There is an excellent paper by biologist Douglas Scheel called How Plants Water Our Planet. It begins, most life on land depends on water from rain, but much of the rain on land may also depend on life. Now, if you just think about this 1 minute, it's actually pretty profound. He looks into recent research showing that vegetation has an influence on rain and rainfall patterns. Most significant are trees, as we've seen, they're champions at transpiration, but also grasses. Transpiration from plants accounts for 80 to 90% of the atmospheric moisture over land, and this is important for rainfall. According to the nonprofit We Forest, about 40% of rainfall over land is recycled from evapotranspiration from landscape surfaces. Ecologists are starting to use the term precipitation shed to describe the source area of land and water that generate a region's rain. Having plant cover with those plants transpiring keeps water in the local system. I talked to one rancher in Kansas, next slide please, named Michael Thompson, hello Michael, who believes that these dynamics made a difference on his land. He says that when there is a lot of fallow in the area, he has observed that the rain seems to split and go around the area. This echoes what a lot of people were telling me in Mexico, that when nothing was growing, there wasn't much rain. So maybe those Chihuahua ranchers that I visited were getting more rain after all, since they were growing more grass. So anyway, it is something to think about. Finally, condensation. This is the process of water vapor turning back into liquid. It is closely connected with transpiration. You can think of it as the meteorological mirror of transpiration. One reason that with plant cover, Michael Thompson sees more rain could be that those plants are releasing tiny particles, aerosols, that provide a surface for water droplets to condense around. We call these kinds of aerosols precipitation nuclei. There's a lot of new research about the microbiology of rain and how bacteria and various volatile organic compounds, Antonio Nobre calls it fairy dust, from plants play a role in creating rainfall. Now, there's plenty of other kinds of dust out there in our environment, namely all the powdery dirt eroding from the world's desertifying surfaces and wafting into the air. It's important to note that these particles are too small to serve as precipitation nuclei. But in the aggregate, this dust does create hazes, often, as Walter Jenna explains, a kind of humid haze that holds heat without the relief of rain. So in other words, this is bringing home the point that our plants are helping to generate rain. So everything works in these cycles that moisture supports the plants move the moisture around, and also through their biological aerosols, through their volatile compounds, these plants are also seeding the rain. So we have this, again, a virtuous cycle that occurs in nature. So this intriguing picture, this is a landscape that is virtually defined by condensation. It is a cloud forest in central Mexico. There are many trees in certain ecosystems that specialize in fog, that literally comb moisture from the air to obtain water. Some of you, so this is, I don't know whether many of you people know the group, well, let me try to say it properly, Grupo Ecologico Sierra Gorda. That's in the state of Querétaro in Mexico, and that's where this cloud forest is. They are working on conservation as well as with grazing management. They have multiple projects going on. They are one busy group. So this cloud forest is being preserved through giving the local people alternatives to bringing their cattle into this fragile area. So what was happening, anyway, yeah, that a lot of their land was desertifying. They were cutting down forest, or they were bringing their cattle into these very fragile forests. So what the Sierra Gorda people did was they helped work with the local people, and they helped give them alternatives. They have created what they call the Flavor Trail, which is a series of small local eateries, and helping them get established, helping them bring their buildings up to code, that kind of thing, helping them learn how to expand their menu, how to maintain their businesses. There's also an artisan trail. So they're helping artisans, people who are doing embroidery and carving and the like, to have viable businesses that way, and also ecotourism. So they're helping people really get their operations up to speed so that they can serve the international community of tourists. So, the beauty of this is that then people can make a living without destroying their own natural ecosystems, which unfortunately many of these people saw that this was the only way that they were able to participate in the larger growing global economy. So Roberto Pedraza Ruiz, who photographed this, has identified, he's a naturalist and a photographer, he has identified 3 new species of magnolia in this particular cloud forest. So that's really pretty cool. Condensation is also a source of water. Next slide. I wrote about a couple in far west Texas who designed their rain barn to collect condensation. So they knew that they were getting water from the condensation at night, from the way that they positioned their where they were facing the sun and they had a kind of upper and lower roofs, that they would get a greater discrepancy between the heat and the cool, and they would get breezes that would come through, and because of the heat hitting the cool air hitting the heat, they would get more moisture. But they didn't realize just how much they were capturing until the winter morning, 4 months after the most recent rainfall, when this water tank overflowed. So that was pretty revealing to them, and really shows us just how much potential there is in working with condensation. They also work with dew in a number of ways, that they position they grow herbs in a way that they are able to keep the plants in the shade as long into the day as possible, so they could keep dew in the system. And far west Texas is another place where it gets awfully hot. They were near Terlingua, where I noticed a bumper sticker that it said something like, hotter than hell and cooler than shit, or something like that. Anyway, that's the spirit that we had down there. Also, another fellow that works with dew, Australian farmer Chris Hengler, who uses holistic management on an area of land that is the size of the 5 boroughs of New York City. He says that he pays as much attention to dew as to other sources of water, as it supports a healthy ecosystem and microclimate. Chris Hengler says there are all those additional microorganisms that can keep active throughout extended periods well after the rainy season, as long as they get a watering each night. In a living system, moisture generates more moisture, of which dew is one manifestation. I have also heard people say that dew is the most important water in a system because it is the most reliable. So I'm going to wrap up here. And what I'm going to close by saying is that, we're talking about water. And through the process of writing about soil and writing about water, the conclusion that has kind of stuck with me, something that I didn't expect was the sense that plants are running the show. I mean, it's really, really powerful just to really understand condensation and to think about condensation and transpiration. And there's a quote from another Australian named Peter Andrews, who he's kind of a maverick horse breeder, farmer, author, personage who developed something called natural sequence farming, which is really, really interesting. And he's written 2 books. One is called Beyond the Brink, and I forget what the other one is called. It also has brink in the title. Anyway, sorry about that. But anyway, his books are brief, and they're focused on Australia, but they have really, really valuable lessons for people in other areas. So one quote from reading those 2 books of his that also has stuck with me. It's very simple, but it speaks to this notion that I'm sharing with you, that the extent to which plants are running the show. He says, plants manage water, and in managing water, they are managing heat. And that very simple statement, I feel, kind of opens up the potential to look at our climate challenges in new ways, as well as our water challenges. And, so we've got plants managing water, and in managing water, they are managing heat. So he describes plants as a kind of pump, a water pump that's in taking in and emitting water, is managing heat, and then points out that we have devegetated about 1/4 of the globe. And this just speaks to the opportunities that we have to restore landscapes, to revegetate, to regreen so many of these landscapes, and so that these landscapes then can be managing water effectively, and in doing so managing heat. Anyway, to me, these connections are really quite compelling. So anyway, I am game for hearing your questions. So I really thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Judy. That was great.
Judy. Woo.
A really good overview, honestly. I've experimented with almost everything you talked about.
All right.
And I thought there was just one question that came up. It's so interesting because almost everyone you brought up, with the exception of Amazonia, it's so many drylands and desertification places, or places that are undergoing desertification, and there's so much difference between Zimbabwe and the Atacama, where all the precipitation is from fog and dew, and there's so many differences in locality, and I think there's a tendency for people who come onto this stuff where they're like, oh, I want to do everything. I'm going to catch all the dew, and I'm going to do holistic plant grazing, and we're going to put in swales. And I think I think that's a phase that people go through when they discover it. And then you find that wherever you are in your particular context requires a particular approach, which is, that's the first thing that Alan talks about in holistic management, is you've got to understand your context. It's the first design principle if you're coming from the permaculture world. It's, observe and interact and get to know your context. But I thought that was a fantastic overview. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
For those of you joining us for the first time, we have a number of related webinars that we've done previously. And to preclude all the questions about if this will be available later, Raleigh and I always make our webinars free to watch for 3 to 4 days after the live show. In fact, most of our audience watches the replay rather than the live webinar, because they're all over the world, and the time doesn't match up with everybody. But we've got a number of related webinars that you can check out on sustainabledesignmasterclass.com. With that being said, let's get to your questions, all right? And all three of us are gonna tackle those one by one. But we've got, we will, all the links. Azita said, can you send me all the links in an email? Azita, which links do you mean? That's my follow-up question.
In the chat box below, I think Tony came on here and posted links to every one of those things that Judith mentioned, Holistic Center for Managed Grazing, Allen Savory Center, the documents about, Chihuahua, Mexico, and the future climate of Amazonia. Those are all in the chat box below. So for everything that Judith mentioned, you can find it in the chat box. So for folks who are looking for it. And yeah, we'll record this. I'm going to copy this right now and make a little document that will attach to the replay in the email. So yeah, that's a good idea. We will attach that in the replay email that we'll send out to everybody. Also, this is exciting. 3 of you have won hardcover copies of all of Judith's books.
Oh,
sweet.
sweet.
Secret till the replay. The 3 of you have won, and we're going to let you know in that replay email. So stick around, and it's only for the 110 of you that showed up that 3 of you have won. So thanks for showing up. That's what it's all about. You show up, cool stuff happens.
All right. I'm gonna duck out real quick. Raleigh, can you take the first set of questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few of you sent us questions beforehand, and we would love to get to those. Let me open it up. It's kind of in my inbox. And the way we really like to do this, if you sent questions beforehand, we love to answer them, but you have to be here. So let me open, if you have questions, just type them in the chat box below and we can get to them. But let me get to a few of your questions that you sent in beforehand. Okay. All right. So this is a question from Gail. Let's see if Gail's here. All right, Gail. She had a question about the Caribbean. Gail is not here, so alas, I'm going to have to go to the next question. Actually, let's just get to the questions in the chat box. Let's just save time. Okay, so here is the first one. Okay, Robert Hayes has another link about the Grupo Ecologico Artisan Trail. Awesome. I'm going to post that in the chat box. Thanks, Robert. So, and TR says, inversion layer effect caused by Humboldt cold current along the coast of Chile north. Any thoughts? All right, fair enough. Yeah, we might need a bit of more information about that. So, also about if any of you want to check out Judith's books, they're all available on judithschwartz.com. We'll send that out in the replay link. But I've been reading Water in Plain Sight, and it's absolutely incredible. It's so accessible because she's going from all these concepts very quickly and in a very easy to understand way. So if you attend our webinars and if the language of Walter Jane, even though it's incredible, or Allen Savory might not connect with you, some of the language in these books will really help you understand these concepts without just being drowned in being drowned in academic and science terminology. Because even though New Water Paradigm is absolutely incredible and you should read it, if you don't understand it, a book like Judith might help you, prime you to understand those concepts. So I encourage you, definitely check out Water in Plain Sight and How to Save the Planet, because they're both incredible. But I can vouch for Water in Plain Sight because I'm reading it and it's awesome. So next question from Azita. Can you send the links in the email? Yeah, absolutely. I'll get to those. So Jennifer is asking, who are the folks in Texas who did the double roof for harvesting dew? Thanks.
Aha. Gosh, they might even be on this webinar. Catherine and Marcus Ottmers. Yeah, I'm trying to. So they did a really lovely podcast. It's called They were on a podcast. Can I make a note to myself and send you that link? Because it's a fabulous conversation, and they are just such creative thinkers. It's extraordinary. I mean, just they think of every detail. I mean, the way that the water flowed in their place, that they knew where, it was the water would flow from the roof, that there was a little bit of water then that fell for the chickens, and that the bees were up here. I mean, they were just on top of everything, and creating little microclimates. It was really, really beautiful. The podcast is called the Life Centered Podcast, and they are, I think, are the most recent interview in that podcast.
Awesome.
But I can get a link too.
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay, another quick follow-up question from Karen. She's asking, where in West Texas were you?
It was close to Terlingua. It was maybe 10 miles. I mean, I can see it. Well, the place we stayed, maybe someone knows West Texas. It was in the Big Bend area near Terlingua, on the road to Terlingua. And we stayed at a place called the Wild Horse Inn. So if that rings any bells. When we were there, the people that, other people that stay at the Wild Horse Inn were apparently people who photograph snakes. So this is what we're talking about.
Snake photographers. Nice.
Apparently they exist.
There we go. So you got it. Some people like taking pictures of birds and trains, but snakes, that's awesome. Okay, so Jennifer's asking, can you provide references pertaining to the research showing plants produce rain?
I would suggest going on the We Forest website. Wow, yeah, there are whole, if you explore the We Forest website and under their science papers, there's some really good research. There's also some research that Walter mentioned last time about the rabbit-proof fence that in Australia, in Western Australia, that inadvertently these people who are trying to keep out rabbits, which are not native to Australia, what they did was they created a kind of science experiment, because on one side of the fence it wasn't the native vegetation. On the other side of the fence, it was used for growing wheat, and it was fallow part of the time of the year. So there's a paper called Clouds Prefer Native Vegetation, because they get more clouds and more rain on where they didn't plow it up. So anyway, I don't know if that research would be relevant, but I recommend We Forest, and then Douglas Shields' paper, How Plants Water Our Planet.
Okay, awesome. So next question is from Igor. He's coming in from Mexico. He's saying, what is your opinion on how water policies interfere with water in sight? And in Mexico, we're expecting a second water law that's going to bring privatization. In general, that's happening around the world.
Gosh, this goes on to a whole other area, but water, I mean, hasn't the UN declared that water is a human right? I mean, I know that there's been some declarations to that effect, but water, the privatization of water is really scary. I remember meeting someone in my travels, someone from Indonesia, who said that in her region, they have some of the best, cleanest water anywhere in the world. And it is being bottled up by a corporation so that the people who live there have to climb up steep hills with buckets to get water. So, yeah, I don't know what's happening in Mexico, but I don't think we need, if we understand how to work with the water cycle, and understand how water works, and take that seriously, and hold on to water, don't let it go to waste, capture water in our urban environments. We don't need to go that route. So.
Yeah, I have to give a shout out to some of the folks that show up in this webinar are actually amazing water practitioners in their own right. We have my partner Neil, he's in Saudi Arabia, trying to restart the biotic pump and restart the small water cycle there in Jeddah, and that's mind blowing what he's doing. But also I've had the pleasure of meeting some of these folks who are in here, like Jeremiah Martin, who's worked for Kyvera Coalition. He's at his own company called Watershed Artisans. And it was incredible seeing them building check dams, essentially pushing the water level up, like they were beavers, like they're pushing the water up, and you're seeing them repair these landscapes by repairing those rivers. And I got to tell it to you, Jeremiah, that was one of the most incredible experiences in water I've had. Also, Brock Dolman's here. He's going to be a future webinar, but if you don't know about Brock, he is about absolute poet when it comes to showing how the potential of water restoration, how we can use beavers, their niche that's been destroyed, how we can bring it back, especially in California. And many of you who are in here are practitioners, and I love hearing what you're doing, and it's awesome. I think Peter Donovan was in here at one point, so this is cool. A lot of the people who are showing up to this, you are doers, and I have to commend you for taking this information and doing something with it. And we're not going to stop talking about water. This is going to keep going on for a month. We're bringing on Vlado Yelchik and Michael Kravchik are going to join us for a new water paradigm webinar. Brock Dolman's going to come on after that, and this conversation, it's going to keep going. We're going to focus on water because it is, like Walter Jane says, like we've been talking about carbon, but we also need to talk about water. And so yeah, thanks for that. Let's go back to the question. So Lisa, here you go. This is a review from Lisa Ripperton. She's saying, I just finished Water in Plain Sight, one of the best books I have ever read. I'm going to read it again so I can make a page of all the links referred to in the footnotes, unless you have something like that available already. Awesome. Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate your insight. So Lana says, would it not help the hydrological cycle by putting life back in the soil, adding back the missing organisms from the soil food web by aerial spraying biodynamics on rainy days globally? Okay, do you have any insight on that, Judith?
Gosh, let me make sure I get that. So that means, what would you be
spraying? So she's suggesting spraying the missing organisms aerially, like biodynamic treatments on trees to get the biology started. Elaine Ingham actually touched on this. Somebody asked her, how do we repair these areas that have been obliterated by forest fires that have took biology levels back to zero? And she said, well, after these forest fires, we should make compost tea treatments that can be sprayed aerially on these forest fire areas to kind of kickstart that biology. And that's a super amazing idea that I don't think anybody's doing. And if anybody is doing it, we would love to know about it, because that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think there's two issues there that I can think of. One is that in the sense of the forest fires, when they've lost all of their ground cover, there's high risk for mudslides, which is what we saw in Santa Barbara after the fires, right? You had the fires that destroyed all of the ground cover and made everything very susceptible to high erosion. And then when heavy rains did come, you got those massive mudslides. And that's a common pattern following forest fires in hilly areas. And in that sense, yeah, aerially spraying could work as long as you know they're going to make it to the ground and not die in the process. There are only three ways to deal with that, right? You can deal with it physically and put in physical barriers. You can deal with it biologically with things like microorganisms or compost sprays or what have you. You can deal with it chemically through through amendments. That's the tools in your toolbox. Anyhow.
Cool, awesome. Yeah, good follow-up to that. So we've got two, okay, we got one short question and two really longer questions that are kind of asking you, giving you a case study and looking for an answer. But first, Roberto is asking, hi Judith, great webinar. Are you familiar with the Loess Plateau in China? Did you research or visit that area? Ooh, that's a good one.
Yes, I know about it, and I know John D. Liu's work. He's a filmmaker who documented the restoration of the Loess Plateau, which is extraordinary, and I really encourage people who don't know about it to check that out. I haven't visited it, but those images are very much, you know, in my head. They're very memorable. I haven't. Has anyone here visited the Loess Plateau?
We're going to send Raleigh one of these days.
Okay.
There we go, building up those points.
That's right.
Raleigh's
going to go film it.
miles for it, but I gotta think of a good time to go there. Yeah, it's like it seems like everyone's only seen it through that film, but man, if someone make a detailed case study of like my experience in the Loess Plateau, how cool would that be? Especially learning from the people who actually did that project and lived on it afterwards. Robert,
there was a conference in Europe recently that Ramis Kent was at, and he met one of the head designers for that program. So there is somebody who is deeply involved in that who is going around speaking. I don't remember his name, but it was the first time that I saw someone from that project who was out speaking about it, not in Mandarin. We've got, okay, here's a question for you, Judy.
Thomas says, I have. Wow.
Who did?
Thomas Kernan. He said he went out there.
Oh, to China?
Awesome. Yeah, he said he went out there, the Loess Plateau area.
Thomas, how long did he spend there?
Yeah.
Thomas is one of our regulars on the webinar, by the way. He shows up most of the time. So let's see if he'll respond to that. In the meantime, we had a question from where did it go?
A good question from Jennifer Brownson. Like we had two really good questions. So Jennifer is saying, I live in a high desert with an arroyo at the bottom of the property. Do you have any suggestions for slowing and sinking water in such places where there are extreme and short-lived flows? Laws prohibit me from building any structures like dams or even gabions. Do you have any simpler ideas that I could use? Would brush dams work, or would they just wash away?
I defer to you. I mean, if yeah.
Neil, you might have some insight on that.
Yeah, I'm not going to offer advice based on 5 lines of questions, but some things you may want to consider are key line plowing. If you're in a high desert, you're likely pretty rocky as well, so that may not be an option. Certainly, holistic management has shown in many different case studies results where they're getting more interception of rainfall into the ground, extending growing periods, and making it through droughts. So cattle are a potential tool. Keyline plowing is a potential tool because you're not actually building a structure there. And it looks a lot like typical farming because you're pulling something that looks like a plow along. But also depending on where you are in your watershed, I don't recommend building anything in the arroyo unless you can start at the top of your watershed, right? Even gabions, especially in incised channels like an arroyo, are prone to side cutting, undercutting, or just being washed out if there's not significant amounts of structures upstream of where that is. You can't just go into the middle of the watershed and put something in there and hope it's going to stick around. Likelihood is it's not, unless you're building a $10 million dam, which most people don't have the resources to build. But so that's what I'll give you on that. It's Yeah, I tend not to give advice over webinars unless I visit a place, but those are some things you may want to look at, Jennifer.
Yeah, maybe sheep or goats,
Yep.
which are, easier to work with for most of us.
Yep. Although I don't like goats. On a personal note, I like sheep a lot better than goats, and they're better for grasses, and for agroforestry as well. Yeah. Judy, we've got a Jan Lambert who's going to introduce you to someone in New Hampshire who's visited the Luz Plateau.
Oh, okay. All right.
All right, so we're going to make a connection there. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's Jan or Jan.
No, this is Jan.
We have it. Okay, you know Jan.
Yes.
And I think that's it. That looks. I think we've covered it. Have we covered it, Raleigh, or have you got some more?
There's one more big, like context question that somebody has. But before that, Leslie's saying another shout out for your book. She's saying, I found Judith's book to be extremely helpful. I borrowed water and bought cows. Excellent and possible for the average person to understand. All right, cool. Yeah, glad you read through her books, Leslie. That's a good recommendation there. All right, so this is a big context question. Judith, if you want to check this out, this is on the questions tab. But I'm gonna try to read this. It's one of those.
Yeah, I don't know if I.
Questions from
George, how to get there. Yeah.
It's kind of like a 3-4 paragraph question.
All right.
Let's read this out. So, thank you for a clear presentation. I'm completely in agreement with your insights and conclusions. So, please don't interpret my question as a negative critique. I have 2 initial impressions. 1, what you presented is parallel to established concepts on permaculture. And 2, many researchers and practitioners who take the water environment topic seriously are probably already well aware, at least intuitively, of the failure of overly simplistic approaches to land management and land conservation. You said we need a new way to talk about water. I agree, but I think solving looming problems will have to include an accounting for humanity's intrinsic economic worldview. How can we move the language such that we are not doomed to waiting until we have to say, see, I told you that would happen? How can scientific knowledge be used for course correction in a world government by short horizon and complex system behavior?
I would also like to know the answer to that myself. I'm in these discussions, I'm trying to reach a broader audience. I mean, I know that people within permaculture are thinking about water, but in our general conversations, in our general policy, even activist conversations, we're not getting this whole context. And it's a really hard question to answer in any coherent way. I will say that before I wrote the book on soil, I had been writing about economics. And so the questions about our economic model are very much present with me. And I've written some columns about, well, as an example, I wrote a column called "The Design Flaw at the Core of Our Malaise," about how our economic model suffers from some basic design flaws, and that is that, one major one is that we don't take natural ecosystem function, we don't assign any value to it. All I'm basically saying is that I share your questions and that we need to continue to engage with all these questions and try to reach out to people who may not be practitioners and help people understand these concepts and what I started with is how people talk about things and the kinds of questions people ask, to bring larger questions out. And one thing I'll also say is all of you, in terms of, what I'm saying, reach out to people who aren't thinking about these things. You can write as well. Write to your local, write letters to the editor, write a column about, people are talking about water, or, even something happening in the news, Cape Town's water crisis. This is what, as a practitioner, I've come to understand about water and would like to share with others, would like other people to encourage to do so as well.
Yeah, Cape Town, that's nuts. That's so nuts where, they see the symptoms coming for probably years and they waited till that very last moment. I think in your book you talk about that moment where Brazil in some cases got to that point where they're having to go dig wells in their backyard to get water. And was that Rio de Janeiro or that was
Sao Paulo?
Sao Paulo, yeah.
That was summer of 2016, where they had a massive drought there, and it was largely attributed to the deforestation. That's upstream hydrologically from them, right? So the deforestation had created this gap in their hydrological cycle where the cloud condensation nuclei, the evapotranspiration wasn't at the same level, and so they went through this drought.
Right. Wouldn't it be better if, rather than being reactive to crises, which is the way that all of our systems are right now, we could start asking questions of how do these systems work, and assign value to, or I don't mean value in monetary terms, but somehow acknowledge the value that those trees are more valuable standing than they are otherwise, than they are gone.
There is a nascent movement to get governments to pay for ecological services through a variety of mechanisms. I don't know that they're going to be successful, but what we're talking about are externalities, right? These are things we don't account for in how we trade and how we manage land, and yet they affect us a great deal. Whether it's deforesting the Midwest and ending up with massive droughts along the Mississippi, or deforesting the Amazon and having massive droughts, in Sao Paulo, or what you're seeing in South Africa right now.
Right. It's the way that we've. I mean, I'll share with you. This is, I guess, getting off the track, or not necessarily. We forget that our economic system is a human construct, and therefore, by definition, we can amend it and change it and inquire and ask questions about it. Whereas how nature works is non-negotiable, but we tend to act as if nature were negotiable, and capitalism cannot be touched or questioned. So anyway, I think that's something we might need to move past.
Yeah. Well, they just found the next, Mayan civilization. It was just found, they just scanned the jungle and they're like, oh, there's another one. There's another one that probably they expended their water cycle and didn't take care of things. Yeah. So lessons are all down.
We're coming up at 90 minutes. I think we should cut the recording.
Okay.
Judy, if you want to stick on and entertain some more discussion, we can keep going if we want, but I think at least we should cut it officially.
Okay. Yeah, we'll cut the recording. Jeremiah Martin wanted me to make a quick update. He Watershed Artisans is Craig Sponholtz's company group. Jeremiah Martin runs Wildland Stewards LLC. So quick correction there. Okay, awesome. So let's cut the recording. We got a few more questions, but for all of you who can't watch beyond this, thanks for tuning in to Sustainable Design Masterclass, and we encourage you all to join our other webinars about repairing land, learning how to use business to do good, and recover ecological health, and just generally design a better world. So thanks for sticking around, and we're cutting the recording. All right, so we are done with the recording. Let's relax. Let's take a break. Put your hair down. Whoosh. Okay. So Christian had a question. He says, "Hello, my name is Christian Hernandez, a senior high school student from Southeast Texas." Yeah, we got a high schooler on. That's awesome. Woo! That's great. The more young folks we have on, the better. So he's saying, "Are artificial irrigation systems unnecessary?" He says, "I design agricultural systems and am currently in a project involving a Malawi orphanage near Lake Malawi. I've been involved in water education and water in relation to larger socio-biological, ecological worldview as a Texas 4-H water ambassador." Man, good job, Christian. You're well on the way. Well on the way to doing cool stuff. But yeah, what were your insights there, Judith?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, irrigation can be really effective and really important, and that I know that the technology of irrigation is allowing more direct and more precise delivery of water. I think that probably a lot of times we default to use irrigation without understanding that it does have consequences ultimately. But in a given project, it's likely very well the best way to serve the community. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts about that, but I'm incredibly impressed with what you're doing.
I'll take that. I'll spend a minute on it. Certainly irrigation is necessary to sustain agriculture as we practice it, in 99% of the farms that we have. The farm that I run, we get on average 2.5 inches of rain a year, and we do not irrigate. We cut all of our irrigation in August of 2016. And the sort of farm I'm running is an agroforestry system. It's based on tree crops. And the trees are trees that can go 3 or 4 years without rainfall. And so the issues with irrigating are numerous, stemming from aquifer depletion. We've got, not where you are in Southeast Texas, Christian, but up in the Panhandle area, Oklahoma, Kansas, and all the areas on top of the Ogallala Aquifer. You've got thousands and thousands of farmers who are draining that aquifer, and it's going to be out of water at current depletion levels within 30 years. And then you're going to have thousands and thousands of farmers who all of a sudden can't farm anymore. All right, and it's likely that unless there's a significant shift in management, there's going to be another dust bowl, but it's not going to be, in the Southeast. It's going to be across that entire region, east of Colorado and west of Iowa. That's one issue. Another issue is that irrigation over time leads to salinization of the soil. And this was one of the primary causes for the downfall of the Babylonian Empire between the Euphrates and the Tigris River, where over hundreds of years they irrigated off of those rivers and turned their land into deserts. And that land is still not productive today, thousands of years later. And that happens because they were flood irrigating. Now, of course, there's different sorts of irrigation, right? There's flood irrigating, as opposed to, say, drip irrigating. But I think technology will make it better. I'm not sure it's ever really going to be sustainable. And that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, I just looking at some of the examples that really just took even the need for heavy irrigation kind of out of the equation. You know, except Holzer examples, Tamara, Extremadura, where they built so much ponds, like the ponds were so big and so deep that the amount of water that they captured was enough for all of their irrigation needs, to supply the water needs for the native oaks in the area. So I just think we're not even scratching the potential of water capture here, and especially in these desert areas, it's just there's so much that can be done.
Yeah, we can certainly we can create systems that don't need it. Whether or not we're going to do that by choice or whether we'll be forced to eventually is another question.
Okay.
All right.
So,
We got a bunch of long comments on here.
Yeah. So Carl's saying we need a cultural shift from a fire drill mentality to a proactive mentality. Any thoughts? Yeah, Judith, did you see with all these folks that you visited, how did you see that their mentality shifted where they decided like, okay, we got to be proactive with restoring water on our land?
Wow. You know, it's hard to say because that's what they were doing, and there are always some people that are looking ahead. One thing that I do think about, and one that does, you know, drive me in this work, is that a lot of people don't think that they don't know that there are possibilities. They think that the conventional way of doing things is the only way of doing things, and they don't know about the stories of restoration. So that's something that I feel compelled to write about, because if these stories aren't told, how will the ordinary person know what's possible? So I think a lot of people are not thinking ahead because, well, I think a lot of people just assume that everything's taken care of, and you know, I know, and I until we run out of water and there's a fire drill. But let's share with people that there are other ways of thinking about things and means of restoring our landscapes.
Yeah, it kind of segues into the next comment question from Tony Gleason. This is a big one. He says, I'm no scientist, but I'm very concerned about the #climate emergency which we are facing. What time frames are you working within? What thoughts and feelings arise when you hear the term climate emergency?
Okay, this also speaks very closely to my concerns that when, you know, the very question is, you know, when you hear that, you think, oh my gosh, this is an emergency. You know, you get like an adrenaline, panicky response, and for many people, they shut down. You know, it's scary. I don't want to engage with something scary, because the way that we've talked about climate change is it's like it's either, you know, like, well, a lot of our discussions about climate change have been about whether someone believes or doesn't believe about it. So a lot of the energy of the climate movement has been to say, yes, see, it's happening. Okay, so a lot of energy going there. And then, yes, it's happening and it's an emergency. But rather than opening it up and asking the question, how does the planet regulate heat? And what are the implications of that? And as Walter Yana explained to us, most of that is through water-based processes. Okay, well, so what are the opportunities that we have there to better work with the water cycle so as to manage, you know, to regulate and moderate our climate? So yeah, it concerns me greatly that we haven't been presenting people with possible solutions. The way that climate change is often talked about is, well, it's only one metric. It's like, just the level of CO2. And people are beginning to realize that just stopping emitting CO2 is not going to get us there. It's not going to get us to where we need to be. But yet the climate movement isn't offering other scenarios of how to, I guess they're beginning to deal with how to bring carbon down through to the soil through photosynthesis. But I think that the questions, we haven't been asking enough questions, and the way that we've been talking about it has been too narrow. I don't know if this addressed your question, but when I hear that way of talking, it makes me really, really sad, because I know that there are especially a lot of young people who don't know that there are ways to truly address our climate concerns, because all they hear is that it's an emergency and no one's offering answers other than to stop, to as Peter Donovan, who was on here, had, gave me this quote, let's wreck the world more slowly. I don't think that's good enough.
Yeah, damn straight. Especially for the folks who start on the path of learning about climate science. It only takes a few months to read about like the worst case possible scenarios. Like you think about amplifying methane feedback loops, and it's terrifying. I remember reading about that. That was my thesis on, and I was paralyzed. I just couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. Like, wow, doomsday, and just being so angry that people who know about that problem and you're not doing anything, and it makes you angry. However, there are, even if people who don't believe about climate change, you can communicate them about the need for ecological restoration, and that's why this idea about water restoration and its climate impact is so important, because it's not just carbon. It's not like just shut off all the oil wells and stop these processes of humanity. It's like learn how to repair the water cycle and restore ecology, and that's how we have our climate impact. And there's people like Nikita Zimov, who by taking bring back megafauna, rewilding, that could help mitigate those almost apocalyptic methane processes. But again, no one's going to solve these issues for us. It'll be like Christina Bertau is in here, and she's been doing a huge effort to educate people about the new water paradigm. It's just going to come down to people banding together and forcing each other to, on land, build ponds, do check dam, do all these processes together.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just my opinion on it. But.
Yeah, a couple of things about how sometimes the way that we talk about things gets limited. So climate science has been driven by the discipline of physics. Okay, so like if you read in the newspaper, in the New York Times or whatever, they're always going to talk to a physicist. Like we have assigned the expertise about climate to physics. Biology has been left out. In soil science, we've assigned that to geologists, and biology has been left out, which is why people often think that it takes 500 years to build an inch of topsoil. That's like only the weathering of rock that will take that long. But biology is left out. And then agricultural science has been dominated by chemistry, and biology has been left out, which explains a lot of where we are right now with our conventional agriculture.
All right, awesome.
I'll just say one more thing, what Raleigh, about what you're talking about how to grapple with these challenges. I was, thinking about all this, and just, sometimes, listening to people argue about, just in our culture about opening areas for oil, and anyway, people just fighting and arguing. And what I came to feel, and which has kind of stayed with me, is that we're not going to get there to where we need to go by fighting and arguing. Okay, We're not going to get there by fear mongering, okay, because people tune out. And what I came to, which I think is what you're talking about, people banding together, we're going to get there by love, by loving the earth, loving each other, loving living things. So kind of a mantra that I've been holding on to has been, let's love our planet back to life. So.
What do you think about this? This is one common theme I've seen in all of these mega restoration projects which have been successful, is that grand vision of that thread that holistic management presents. Like Luz Plateau, they gave every farmer who's part of that a stake in it. The Sarawak Malaysia project with Willie Smith, which is reforesting tens of thousands of acres of rainforest, they're like, everyone who does this is going to have a stake in it. You're going to be part of this vision. And saving the Great Bear Rainforest, and Pioneers, the woman who helped organize that, she got lumber companies and conservationists and Native, First Nations people to have a common stake in it. They all shared this common vision that I think holistic management is so important. It's like, how do you get these different people who have way different viewpoints to have a similar vision that's so grand that they're all going to work together? Like, what have you seen projects like that, or what do you see, like let's say holistic management projects that are really big? What examples?
Well, I guess what your question is leading me to is, it's an understanding that, the challenges are human, are people getting along with each other, and, like making sure that, one person's desire for control over over a project isn't going to undermine other people, people's competing views. One thing that I've gotten interested in, and actually this is someone you might want to have on your for your design, your masterclass, is the consensus model, a fellow named Jeff Goebel. And I learned about him through Peter Donovan, and their mentor in this process was someone named Bob Chadwick, who's no longer living. But there's some beautiful films of a project that Bob Chadwick helped usher through in Oregon, in the Klamath River area, where there were tribes people and farmers and ranchers and fishermen that all wanted something different out of this, and how they were able to see that by truly listening to each other and understanding what what they thought were their opponents, what their higher aspirations were, and that ultimately they wanted the same things, which was a healthy ecosystem, they were able to really make some great strides. So Jeff Goebel is the fellow. His website is aboutlistening.com. And on his website is something that says The Climate Story. And that's an 18-minute film that offers a lot of hope of how to move forward.
Yeah, that's huge. Like, how are we going to get people who don't even believe in climate change to care about water? Because I'm sure they do. Like, for example, Southern California, there's that insane story about the Resnicks. One family, one guy, his farms that he's not even there, but he manages, he owns, uses more water. One man's properties uses more water than all of LA. And when you think about it, that's just so ridiculous. And he's a liberal guy, and yet he's doing more damage than probably, so many people who don't believe in climate change, don't care about ecology, because his ethics about water are just non-existent, which is just nuts. Like, how are we going to connect with those sort of folks? So Christian, so this is interesting. You're saying you're a senior in high school. It's pretty incredible that you're already tuned into this. It took me probably till I was 22 to even give a crap. Well, I'm sure some people think about this a lot earlier, especially now. But see, he's saying How can I best approach an interview with a local politician about the need for water conservation? My city is rapidly expanding, and I'm thinking about building a buffer for the local bayou. Thanks, Neil, for insight on agroforestry. My agriculture method is called Restoration Ecoculture, restorationecoculture.com. Uses large nut trees for forest savanna restoration in Malawi and Texas. Good stuff. Good stuff. So yeah, how would you approach talking to somebody like a local politician?
Ask to speak with them. I think that any local politician who hears from a high school senior who is doing, is engaging in such a sophisticated way in these matters, I mean, how could they not be happy to see you? Simply write a note, call their office, think about what you want to say and have a conversation, and know that and I wouldn't put pressure on yourself. Know that you're going to be practicing how to do this, and you will be meeting many other officials and experts and all sorts of people as you move on.
Hope that answers your question. He's saying, I also plan to incorporate megafauna restoration into my model if I receive an undergraduate ecology degree. Can I deal with mountain tapirs and other endangered species, or do I need a PhD? There we go. I wish I had $1 billion so I could be like, you know what? Let's bring back elephants and camels to the Southwest because they were there 5,000 years ago. The landscape remembers them. But Judith, did you encounter folks, who are using holistic management who were dealing with, species that weren't just cows, but like endangered species and megafauna?
No,
Okay.
I haven't. No.
But like Alan Savory had elephants on his property, right?
Yes, very much so. But they weren't being managed. The only way that the elephants were being managed was that the villagers would, fence out their, put fences around their gardens because they didn't want the elephants to trample them. But no, the elephants were very much a part of the ecosystem, but they were not managed. They were acknowledged, and that within their holistic context was the goal of living in harmony with the wildlife that was present. I mean, Alan Savory, I know people often, think about him as the guy with all the cows, but ultimately his goal is to have the land restored to the point where they don't need the domestic animals anymore, but that the wild animals could maintain the land as they had before people interfered.
Awesome. Yeah, there's this really cool book. It's really great to listen to an audiobook. It's Twilight of the Mammoth, Paul Martin. And his end thesis was that all these areas in the Southwest, they were decimated long ago by overhunting of the camels, of the horses, of the elephants, and that they could be brought back to North and South America. That was his final statement is all these species, we should bring back elephants, of course, elephants, bison, camels, and horses. These are natural, these are endemic to North America, and we could release them into the landscape, and they already have the niche for them in those landscapes. And I don't think there's a more amazing vision of the future than imagine being in the Southwest and encountering elephants and camels. It's something that may not happen in our generation, but it could happen at the end of our lifetime. It's a vision. I really love that book, Dune. I'm sure, Judith, you've read Dune, right?
No,
yeah.
People have talked about it, but no, I haven't been a science fiction.
The reason I go back to that, because in that book, Herbert introduced the concept, terraforming, his idea about these Fremen, these people stuck on this desert planet. And one ecologist comes there And they have this vision that we're going to collect all our water from our bodies and store it in aquifers below. And he's saying in 200 years' time, we're going to move towards this vision of terraforming the surface of this planet. And even though it's a sci-fi story, they just have this wonderful concept of what it will take to terraform ecology. And, you know, a lot of these grand visions, like they won't happen maybe in our generation, but in our lifetime, we could, you know, we have to have this great vision for what we can accomplish in terms of restoring ecology.
Yeah, what I find really interesting about the megafauna is their role in the nutrient cycle. You know, so in my work, I've been focusing on the carbon cycle, the water cycle, a little bit on the energy cycle, but then there's the nutrient cycle, and just the extent to which these large animals would move nutrients. It's really, really powerful. I learned a little bit when I spent some time in Norway, and a fellow that, you know, I spent time with, who I met through holistic management circles, is very interested in megafauna and attended the Oxford Megafauna Conference. So I learned a lot about megafauna in the context of Scandinavia. Interesting. I just lost your sound.
Oh, that's because my sound was turned off. Apologies
okay.
there.
It's okay.
Awesome. Oh, hey, how about, I know I'm taking about more time than you expected, Judy, but we might do something. We can have people call in. Do you want to do a call-in question before kind of we end things?
Sure.
Okay, great. Okay, everybody, we're going to do a fun thing. We're going to do a call-in question. So to do that, you simply, you know, there should be a big hand. You do that and you highlight the hand or the question. But yeah, let us know if you have a burning question and you have a webcam or a microphone, then we can allow you to call in. So let's see here. Who has a question they really, really want to ask? Let's see. Christian Hannes, are you there? Do you have a webcam capability? What about Karen? Well, you gotta say in the chat box that, yeah, like, please, I want to call in. Otherwise, you know, no worries here. So it looks like, okay, he says no. Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, no worries. How about we just answer one or two more questions and then we'll just call it a night here. So Jan says, could you put in a few words on the importance of beavers in creating and maintaining water-rich landscapes that help the water cycle?
Okay. Beavers, who many people call them nature's engineers, their dam building behavior slows water, spreads water, and sinks water, so that they are, in essence, creating wetlands. They're allowing water to linger. So in beaver-less landscapes, water may be just rushing past, and in doing so, often, you know, creating erosion, and the water doesn't stay in the local system. But the beavers are keeping the water in the local system. I hope that works, Jan. I know that if you're the Jan I think you are, you would be able to answer that question very beautifully.
And we got Brock Dolman on. He can, boy, he's going to be exciting because he's worked on, beavers have been his passion, and he speaks wonderfully about bringing beavers back to California and the United States and the importance of beavers just in our existence, because without beavers, you know, our land is so parched compared to what it once was, because that's their purpose. They are builders. They are dam builders. They are pond builders. And there used to be, I may be oversimplifying it, but I think there was 250 million of them in the early 1800s before, well, probably 1700s before trapping, and now there's only, I think, 10 million or 20 million. So just think about, without the beavers, how much little pond building is going on naturally.
And a little public service announcement. There's a book coming out with my publisher, Chelsea Green Publishing, on beavers. That should be really great. So stay tuned for that.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that's about it. Oh, Christian. Okay, one last question. He's saying, what is the perspective on water and climate change of Rice, Harvard, and similar universities? I have acceptance to Rice and hope for Harvard. Ooh, good stuff. We have a webinar on Tom Fernley Pearson. He is basically, he tied into solutions for algae blooms and rice cultivation in our webinar on aquaculture. So I could send that to you if you email me, Raleigh. It's a Sustainable Design Masterclass. I'm sorry, Judith, I cut you off there. Please.
No, that's okay. I don't know, but wouldn't it be wonderful for you to bring a broader perspective to your classmates and your professors?
Cool.
So
also,
education's a two-way thing.
Yeah, I mean, most people, I guarantee you, in biology class, they're hardly even going to touch on these concepts in ecology. Like these things are so new that they still might be talking about, like they might touch on deforestation in ecology class, but they won't talk about soil. They'll hardly talk about soil biology or rewilding or FMNR. You know, go through our webinars and find these concepts, because you can talk directly to someone who has reforested 2 million acres of land, and they're very accessible. These people who are mind-blowing scientists, they're extremely accessible. So I encourage you, Christian, just, you know, find these people you want to talk to, and you can reach out to them. We'll help you talk to them if you want to. And what else? Yeah, there's also in the book, Project Drawdown, they talk about rice as a way to remove carbon. It's simply there's flooding techniques, and they said that that's a main way to reduce the methane levels in rice by just simply educational methods of, hey, you're flooding your paddies wrong. This will reduce the methane. So look at that book, Project Drawdown, because they go into that in terms of carbon sequestration through different rice cultivation techniques. All right. Oh, shout out from Carl, Ecology of the Beavers. I'll paste that down below. Thanks, Carl. And one last connection from Holly Myers. He's saying, Karen, I work with wild horses, and that's our goal. Currently working on a 2,000-acre grassland restoration site in southeast Colorado with wild horses. Whoa, Holly. Okay, I'll follow you up with you on your email. That's really cool. We'd love to hear about 22,000 acres of restoration and using horses to do it. That's really cool. Okay, everybody. I think that's about our time today. Thanks for all. I think at our height, we had about 110 people jump in, but 60 of you stuck around for 2 hours to learn about ecology and water restoration. So, Judith, I want to thank you for your time and being an excellent presenter. And again, appreciate you for putting in 2 decades, decades of your life into this work. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And yeah, we'll proceed. I've learned a lot too.
Cool. And Judith, should we post your email, or do you want to keep that confidential?
It's okay. It's okay.
Okay, great. So in our email, I'll include your email in here if people have follow-up questions for Judith. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm Raleigh. It's a Sustainable Design Masterclass. You can simply reply to the replay email if you want to get a hold of me. And thanks again for your time, everybody. Let's keep doing this, and keep tuned for more water restoration webinars. This is part 2 of our, I think, 4-part series on it. And the next one's going to be absolutely mind-blowing, because we're going to be introduced to a concept for global water cycle restoration. And you're going to need to take part in that. So thanks, everybody, and have a great, amazing weekend. Bye-bye.